Welcome, and thank you for being here tonight. Tonight, we are going somewhere different. Tonight, we are stepping away from the hardwood floors and the squeaking sneakers and the echo of a bouncing ball in an empty arena. Tonight, we are stepping onto the grass. There is a sport in America that stops the entire country every single week. Not a city, not a region, the whole country. On autumn Sundays, restaurants empty out. Families gather around television screens. Strangers in sports bars cheer and groan together like old friends. Grown men sit in freezing stadiums with painted faces, their breath rising in white clouds, screaming at the top of their lungs. For 3 hours, whatever else is happening in the world fades quietly into the background. That sport is professional football. And the league that carries it, the National Football League, has given America some of the most extraordinary stories it has ever told itself. The NFL was not always the unstoppable giant it is today. It began in 1920 as a small collection of regional teams playing in front of modest crowds in Midwestern cities: Canton, Decatur, Akron, Rock Island. Teams that no longer exist. Cities that most people could not find on a map. Men who played brutal football for a few dollars a game and worked regular jobs during the week just to get by. Nobody watching those early games could have imagined what professional football would one day become. Over the century that followed, the NFL grew into something unlike any sports league the world had ever seen. It survived wars and labor strikes and scandal. It lost franchises and built new ones. It placed teams in cities that had never watched professional football before, and those cities fell completely in love. It gave us moments woven into the fabric of the American story. A catch so impossible it became known simply as the catch. A drive so relentless it was called simply the drive. A comeback so unthinkable that people who were there still shake their heads decades later. It gave us dynasties. The Pittsburgh Steelers of the 1970s, winning 4 Super Bowls in 6 seasons. The San Francisco 49ers of the 1980s, playing football so precise it looked more like a symphony. The Dallas Cowboys, who ruled an entire decade. The New England Patriots, who seemed for 20 years to exist outside the normal rules governing every other team in the league. And it gave us individuals who became something larger than athletes. Jim Brown, Johnny Unitas, Walter Payton, Jerry Rice, Lawrence Taylor, Barry Sanders, Peyton Manning, Tom Brady. Names that carry weight, even with people who have never watched a single game of football in their lives. Tonight, we are going to travel through all of that history together. Through the frozen tundra of Lambeau Field and the blinding lights of the Super Bowl, and the quiet moments in locker rooms where championships were truly won and lost before the opening kickoff happened. Through stories that never made the highlight reels. Players who gave absolutely everything and were forgotten too soon. Coaches who changed the game in ways that are still deeply felt today. There is nothing you need to do right now. No place you need to be. Just breathe, settle in, and let the stories carry you. The game is about to begin now. Long before the Super Bowl, long before Monday Night Football and billion-dollar television deals and stadiums that hold 100,000 people, long before any of it, there was a showroom floor in Canton, Ohio. On September 17, 1920, a group of men gathered inside the Hutmobile automobile dealership owned by a man named Ralph Hay. They sat on running boards and fenders because there were not enough chairs. They drank beer from buckets. And in that cramped, unremarkable room, they formed what would eventually become the most powerful sports league in American history. They called it the American Professional Football Association. Nobody outside that room paid very much attention. Professional football had existed in scattered pockets before that evening. Small towns in Ohio and Pennsylvania had been paying men to play since the 1890s, but there was no organization, no common rules, no shared schedule. Players jumped from team to team mid-season for a few extra dollars. Nobody knew who the best team in the country truly was. The men in that showroom wanted to fix that. Among them was Jim Thorpe, perhaps the most celebrated athlete in America at the time. Thorpe had won 2 gold medals at the 1912 Olympics in the pentathlon and the decathlon. He moved with a combination of power and grace that left defenders grasping at air. He was named the first president of the new league, more for his famous name than any administrative skill. He was not a great president, but he was a magnificent football player. The early years were rough and uncertain. Teams came and went. The Muncie Flyers, the Rochester Jeffersons, the Columbus Panhandles made up almost entirely of the Nesser family, 6 brothers who played together on the same professional team while also working as boilermakers for the Pennsylvania Railroad during the week. In 1922, the league changed its name to the National Football League. The financial margins were razor thin. Players made very little money. The whole enterprise felt fragile, more like a collection of loosely connected local teams than a true national league. And yet, it survived. The team that anchored the early NFL more than any other was the Canton Bulldogs, who won back-to-back championships in 1922 and 1923. Players wore leather helmets or nothing at all. There were no forward passes. Football was a grinding contest of strength and will, settled entirely on the ground. One man who would change that was a quarterback named Sammy Baugh. Baugh arrived in 1937, drafted by the Washington Redskins out of Texas Christian University. He was tall and thin and looked nothing like the bruisers who populated the rest of the rosters. What he could do with a football was entirely new. He threw it, accurately, often, from all angles and distances. The forward pass had been legal since 1906, but most teams treated it as a trick play rather than a weapon. Baugh threw with precision that had never been seen at the professional level. In 1945, he threw for more touchdowns than incompletions, a ratio never matched before or since in the history of professional football. He also punted and played defensive back. Because in the early NFL, most players played both offense and defense for 60 straight minutes, with no substitutions and no rest. They were not pampered athletes. They were workers who loved the game deeply enough to absorb punishment for it every Sunday. By the late 1940s, the NFL faced its most serious competitive threat yet. A new league called the All-America Football Conference began play in 1946, drawing fans and players away from the established league. The two competed bitterly before merging in 1950. 3 AAFC teams joined the NFL: the Cleveland Browns, the San Francisco 49ers, and the Baltimore Colts. The Browns arrived having won every single AAFC championship in the league's 4-year history. NFL owners dismissed them. What could these newcomers possibly offer? In their very first NFL season, the Cleveland Browns won the championship. Coach Paul Brown's meticulous approach to playbooks, film study, and player development was years ahead of anything the NFL had been doing. He had essentially invented the modern system of coaching, and his influence still runs through every level of football played today. The NFL was growing. Slowly, imperfectly, but growing. It had survived the Depression and the Second World War, when many players went overseas and some teams had to merge just to field enough men to play a game. It had outlasted rival leagues and absorbed their best teams. And somewhere just over the horizon, a new invention called television was about to change everything entirely. The game that had started on a showroom floor in Canton, Ohio, was about to meet this modern world. By the early 1950s, professional football was growing, but it was still a distant second to baseball in the hearts of most Americans. Baseball was the national pastime, summer afternoons and radio broadcasts, in a game that felt as old and comfortable as the country itself. Football was something rougher, something colder, something people watched on muddy November afternoons in half-empty stadiums before going home for dinner. That was about to change, and the instrument of that change was a small, glowing screen sitting in the corner of America's living rooms. Television was spreading across the United States at a remarkable pace. In 1950, roughly 10% of American homes had a television set. By 1960, that number had climbed close to 90%. Some NFL owners feared that broadcasting games would keep fans away from stadiums. Others saw the opportunity clearly. Commissioner Bert Bell understood, almost instinctively, that football was built for television in a way baseball was not. The action was visible, the strategy readable. The game stopped constantly, for timeouts, penalties, measurement, giving broadcasters time to explain what was happening to audiences still learning the rules. Bell negotiated the NFL's first significant television contracts and positioned the league to take full advantage of the medium that would define the second half of the 20th century. He did not live to see how right he was. Bert Bell died of a heart attack in 1959, watching a game from the stands. On December 28, 1958, something happened at Yankee Stadium in New York City that changed professional football forever. The Baltimore Colts and the New York Giants met for the NFL championship in front of a packed stadium and a television audience of 45 million people, the largest ever to watch a professional football game at that point in history. The Giants led late in the fourth quarter. The Colts, trailing by 3 points with just over 2 minutes remaining, had the ball deep in their own territory. The situation looked hopeless. Most people watching at home had already assumed the game was finished and the Giants had won. Then, Johnny Unitas went to work. Unitas was not supposed to be there. He had been cut by the Pittsburgh Steelers in 1955 without ever playing a single regular season game. He spent a year playing semi-professional football for $6 a game on a field that reportedly had a rock sitting in one of the end zones. The Baltimore Colts signed him almost as an afterthought in 1956. What they got was the greatest quarterback of his generation. Unitas stood in the pocket with a stillness that bordered on supernatural. He went through his reads calmly while enormous linemen tried to bring him to the ground. Receivers ran their routes, knowing the ball would be exactly where Unitas told them it would be. He drove the Colts 86 yards in those final 2 minutes, converting a critical third down with a precise sideline pass that has been studied in football classrooms ever since. Baltimore kicked a field goal to tie the game with 7 seconds remaining. For the first time in NFL history, a championship game would go to sudden death overtime. The concept was so new that broadcasters had to explain it to viewers. If either team scored, the game was immediately over. Across the country, people leaned toward their television sets and did not move. Unitas took the field and moved Baltimore methodically downfield, mixing runs with short passes, never forcing anything, never panicking. With first and goal at the 1-yard line, rather than kick a safe field goal, Unitas threw a daring pass toward the edge of the end zone. His coach questioned it afterward. On the very next play, fullback Alan Amici crashed over the goal line. The game was over. Sports writers called it the greatest game ever played. Whether that title is deserved is still debated, but the impact is not in dispute. 45 million Americans watched in a way they never had before, completely invested, on the edges of their seats, and they all wanted more. The NFL that emerged from the late 1950s was a fundamentally different institution from the one that had stumbled through its early decades. New Commissioner Pete Rozelle negotiated a landmark television deal that gave every NFL team an equal share of the league's national broadcast revenue, preventing large market teams from financially overwhelming smaller ones. A team in Green Bay, Wisconsin, could now genuinely compete with a team in New York City. It was a radical and genuinely transformative idea, and it worked brilliantly. Professional football was no longer just a sport. It was a national television event, and it was about to face the most serious rival it had ever encountered. The rival that professional football was about to face was not quiet or apologetic about its arrival. In 1960, a new league called the American Football League began play with 8 teams spread across cities the NFL had largely ignored: Dallas, Denver, Oakland, Boston, Kansas City. The AFL was loud and colorful and unafraid. It put names on the backs of jerseys before the NFL did. It embraced high-scoring offenses at a time when the NFL still prized grinding, physical football above everything else. Most NFL owners dismissed it entirely. They had seen rival leagues come and go before. Every single one of them had failed. This one would not. The man most responsible for the AFL's survival was a young Texas oil heir named Lamar Hunt. Hunt had approached the NFL about bringing a franchise to Dallas and been flatly turned away. Rather than accept the rejection, he reached out to several other wealthy men who had also been refused NFL franchises and proposed something genuinely audacious. They would build their own league completely from scratch. The NFL laughed. Hunt was patient, methodical, and deeply passionate about football in a way that went far beyond business calculation. He would go on to become one of the most consequential figures in the history of professional sports. But in 1960, standing against the most powerful sports league in America with nothing but money and belief, the odds were heavily against him. The two leagues fought bitterly for players, for cities, and for survival throughout the early 1960s. The NFL placed a franchise in Dallas to compete directly with Hunt's AFL team. The AFL responded by signing college stars that the NFL had assumed were theirs. Bidding wars drove player salaries to levels that alarmed owners on both sides. The competition was expensive, exhausting, and occasionally very ugly. But the AFL refused to die. Its games were entertaining and wide open. Its style was exciting in a way that felt new and different. Fans in cities like Kansas City and San Diego who had never had professional football before fell completely and helplessly in love with their new teams. And then came Joe Namath. Joseph William Namath grew up in Beaver Falls, Pennsylvania, a steel town where football was the common language. He was recruited by Bear Bryant to the University of Alabama, where he became one of the most celebrated college quarterbacks in the country. The AFL's New York Jets signed him in 1965 for the staggering sum of $427,000, a contract so large it made national headlines and told the entire country that the AFL was a serious enterprise that was simply not going away. Namath was handsome, charismatic, and utterly unafraid of attention. He wore a fur coat on the sidelines. He appeared in television commercials. He said things publicly that quarterbacks simply did not say in that era. He was the first true celebrity athlete of the television age, a quarterback who lived as much in the culture as on the field. And he could play. By 1966, both leagues had exhausted themselves financially. The bidding wars for college talent had become completely unsustainable. Quiet negotiations began behind closed doors. And on June 8, 1966, the NFL and the AFL announced they would merge into a single, unified league, to be fully consolidated by 1970. As part of the merger agreement, the champions of each league would meet at the end of each season in a single championship game. Lamar Hunt, the man the NFL had once laughed at, suggested a name for that game. His daughter had a toy called a Super Ball. He wrote the word down in a memo almost casually, barely thinking about it. The Super Bowl. The first two championship games were won easily by the NFL's Green Bay Packers, led by the legendary Vince Lombardi. The AFL was still considered the inferior league. The outcome of the merger seemed decided before it truly began. Then came Super Bowl III. 3 days before the game, Joe Namath stood at a podium in Miami and guaranteed, publicly and without hesitation, that his New York Jets would defeat the heavily favored Baltimore Colts. No quarterback had ever done such a thing. The Colts were 18-point favorites. The NFL had won both previous Super Bowls by enormous margins. Namath's guarantee was treated as the reckless boast of a young man who did not understand what he was facing. On January 12, 1969, the Jets won 16-7. Namath walked off the field with his finger raised toward the sky, a photograph that would come to define an entire era. The AFL had proven itself. The merger was real. And the Super Bowl, named from a child's toy in an offhand memo, would grow into the single most watched annual television event in American history. By the time the 1970s arrived, professional football had become something the country could not stop watching. The Super Bowl was only 4 years old, and already it was the most anticipated sporting event of the entire year. Cities across America were building new stadiums. Television networks were paying more and more for broadcast rights. The NFL was no longer a scrappy upstart fighting for respect. It was the dominant sport in the most powerful country in the world. And in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, a city built on steel and hard labor and a deep distrust of anything that came easy, a dynasty was quietly and patiently taking shape. The Pittsburgh Steelers had been one of the most consistently disappointing franchises in professional football since their founding in 1933. For nearly 4 decades, they had drafted poorly, coached inconsistently, and lost with a regularity that had become almost expected. Pittsburgh fans loved their team the way people love something that has always let them down, stubbornly, out of sheer loyalty. Then, in 1969, the Steelers hired a 37-year-old coach from Baltimore named Chuck Noll. Noll was quiet and cerebral, nothing like the fire and brimstone coaches who populated NFL sidelines. He did not yell. He did not give thundering speeches. He evaluated talent with clinical precision, built his roster methodically through the draft, and installed a system that demanded discipline and accountability from every single player on the field. In the 1974 NFL Draft, the Steelers made a series of selections that would become the most celebrated draft class in the history of professional football. In the first round, they selected a receiver from Alabama named Lynn Swann. In the second round, a linebacker from Kent State named Jack Lambert. In the fourth round, a receiver named John Stallworth. In the fifth round, a center named Mike Webster. 4 players from a single draft. All 4 would eventually be inducted into the Pro Football Hall of Fame. Combined with players already on the roster, quarterback Terry Bradshaw, running back Franco Harris, defensive tackle Joe Green, cornerback Mel Blount, linebacker Jack Ham, the Steelers had assembled one of the most talented rosters professional football had ever seen. They were young, they were physical, and they were just getting started. The defense that Pittsburgh built in those years became known as the Steel Curtain. It was not a nickname given lightly. The Steelers' defense was suffocating in a way that opposing offenses had no real answer for. Joe Green, known as Mean Joe Green, anchored the defensive line with a combination of strength and speed that most offensive linemen simply could not handle alone. He required double teams constantly, which freed the linebackers behind him to roam and destroy. Jack Lambert was the embodiment of everything that defense stood for. He played with a ferocity that seemed to go beyond football, gap-toothed and wild-eyed, moving sideline to sideline, making tackles with a controlled violence that made television audiences lean back in their chairs. The Steel Curtain did not merely stop opponents, it demoralized them. Between 1974 and 1979, the Pittsburgh Steelers won 4 Super Bowls. No team had ever done that in a single decade. No team has done it since. Each championship had its own defining moment. Franco Harris's immaculate reception in the 1972 playoffs, a deflected pass caught inches from the turf that remains one of the most debated and celebrated plays in NFL history. Lynn Swann's acrobatic catches in Super Bowl X, diving and spinning through the air with a grace that seemed impossible for a man playing football. Terry Bradshaw developing from a raw and inconsistent young quarterback into a 2-time Super Bowl MVP who performed at his best when it mattered most. Pittsburgh won because of talent, but they also won because of character, a hardness that reflected the city they played for. The Steelers' dynasty meant something to Pittsburgh that went beyond wins and trophies. The city's steel industry was collapsing in those same years. Mills were closing. Jobs were disappearing. The community that had built itself on iron and fire was watching that foundation crack beneath it. The Steelers gave Pittsburgh something to hold on to, pride and identity, at a moment when both felt genuinely fragile. Chuck Noll retired in 1991 with 4 Super Bowl rings, more than any head coach in NFL history at that time. Joe Green became the face of the league in a Coca-Cola commercial still remembered decades later. The black and gold became one of the most recognized sports uniforms anywhere in the world. The Steel Curtain had fallen, but what it left behind in that city would never be forgotten. If the Pittsburgh Steelers of the 1970s represented football as brute force, a game of iron will and physical punishment, then the San Francisco 49ers of the 1980s represented something entirely different. They represented football as art. What Bill Walsh built in San Francisco during that decade was not just a dynasty, it was a philosophy, a completely new way of thinking about how the game could be played, one that would reshape professional football so fundamentally that its influence is still visible on every NFL field today. Bill Walsh arrived as head coach of the 49ers in 1979 and inherited a franchise that had won nothing of significance in years. He was cerebral and meticulous, a man who scripted his team's first 25 offensive plays before each game began and then carefully adjusted from there. He treated football like a chess match, thinking several moves ahead, creating advantages through precision and timing rather than raw power. The system he developed became known as the West Coast offense. It was built around short, horizontal passes that replaced the running game as the engine of the offense. Rather than run the ball to set up the pass, Walsh passed the ball to set up the run. Receivers ran precise routes to precise spots on the field. Timing was everything. The quarterback did not need to be a cannon-armed giant. He needed to be smart, accurate, and utterly calm under pressure. Walsh found exactly that man in the 3rd round of the 1979 NFL Draft. Joseph Clifford Montana grew up in Monongahela, Pennsylvania, just 17 miles from where Joe Namath had grown up a generation earlier. He was not heavily recruited. He was not considered a sure thing at any level. He arrived at Notre Dame as a 7th-string quarterback and clawed his way to the starting position through sheer persistence and a quality that scouts struggled to measure on paper: composure. Montana simply did not panic. In situations that caused other quarterbacks to rush, to force throws, to make the costly mistakes that lost games, Montana slowed down. He saw the field with a clarity that seemed almost unfair. He made the right decision, not the exciting one, not the risky one, the right one, every time. He was not the fastest. He did not have the strongest arm. but no quarterback in the history of professional football has ever been more dangerous with the game on the line. The 49ers won their first Super Bowl following the 1981 season, defeating the Cincinnati Bengals. The defining moment of that game, and perhaps of Montana's entire career, came with the 49ers trailing by 6 points late in the fourth quarter, 89 yards from the end zone. The stadium noise so deafening that players on the field could scarcely hear the snap count. Montana drove the 49ers the length of the field. He completed 8 consecutive passes, and with less than a minute remaining, he found receiver Dwight Clark leaping at the back of the end zone for a touchdown that became known simply as the catch, one of the most iconic plays in NFL history. San Francisco won, and a dynasty was born. Over the course of the 1980s, the 49ers won 4 Super Bowls. In 1982, 1985, 1989, and 1990. Montana was named Super Bowl MVP 3 times. He threw for over 11,000 yards in Super Bowl play alone. And across all of those games, in all of those high-pressure moments, he never once threw an interception in the fourth quarter of a Super Bowl. Not once. The receiving core around him was extraordinary. Dwight Clark, whose leaping catch had launched the dynasty. And then Jerry Rice, widely considered the greatest receiver in the history of professional football. Rice ran routes with a precision that bordered on mathematical. He caught everything. He turned short passes into long gains through sheer effort and a determination that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than athletic talent alone. Rice and Montana together were something the NFL had simply never seen. Bill Walsh retired after the 1989 season, handing the team to his assistant, George Seifert. The 49ers won the Super Bowl the following year. The legacy Walsh left behind went far beyond San Francisco. Coaches who had worked under him spread the West Coast offense across the league. Teams that had once dismissed the short passing game as too complicated or too soft began installing it. The NFL gradually shifted away from the run-first philosophy that had defined the sport for decades. Every quarterback today who manages the game efficiently, who uses the short pass as a weapon, who reads the field rather than forcing the ball, plays in the shadow of what Bill Walsh built. And at the center of it all, calm and precise and impossibly good when the moment demanded it most, was Joe Montana. Chapter 6: America's Team and the Dallas Cowboys Dynasty. If the 1980s belonged to San Francisco, the 1990s belonged to Dallas. The Dallas Cowboys had been one of the most glamorous franchises in professional football since the 1970s. A team so popular, so widely followed, so deeply embedded in the national consciousness that a television documentary had given them a nickname that would stick forever: America's Team. Not everyone loved that name. Opposing fans despised it with a particular intensity. But the Cowboys had earned it through decades of success, star power, and a cultural presence that extended far beyond the football field into the broader fabric of American life. And in the early 1990s, they were about to remind the entire country exactly why. The Cowboys of the early 1990s were not built gradually. They were rebuilt almost overnight, and the architect of that reconstruction was a man named Jimmy Johnson. Johnson had been a college coach at the University of Miami, where he won a national championship with a roster full of players most programs were afraid to recruit. He was intense, demanding, and supremely confident in his own ability to evaluate football talent. His hair, helmet perfect and seemingly never moving, became as recognizable as the star on the Dallas helmet. In 1989, Johnson and his longtime friend Jerry Jones purchased the Cowboys together. The team they inherited was in serious disarray. They went 1-15 in Johnson's first season. The roster was thin and unhappy. The future looked genuinely bleak. Johnson did not panic. He rebuilt through the draft with speed and precision that stunned the rest of the league. The centerpiece of that rebuild was a quarterback from UCLA named Troy Aikman. Aikman was selected first overall in the 1989 NFL Draft. He was tall, strong-armed, and utterly unflappable. A quarterback who processed the game quickly, delivered the ball with mechanical accuracy, and almost never made the costly turnover that changed the outcome of games. Around him, Johnson assembled two other cornerstones that would define the decade. Running back Emmitt Smith, selected in the first round of the 1990 draft, would go on to become the all-time leading rusher in NFL history, surpassing even the great Walter Payton. And wide receiver Michael Irvin, already on the roster, gave Dallas one of the most physically imposing and emotionally fierce weapons at the position in the entire league. Aikman, Smith, Irvin. They called them simply the Triplets. The Cowboys won their first Super Bowl of this new era following the 1992 season, defeating the Buffalo Bills convincingly and with remarkable ease. They won again the following year, beating the Bills once more. Buffalo had now lost 4 consecutive Super Bowls, a record of heartbreak in the biggest game that no franchise in NFL history has ever matched before or since. Jimmy Johnson departed after those first 2 championships, his relationship with owner Jerry Jones having fractured beyond repair. Barry Switzer stepped in as his replacement. The Cowboys won a 3rd Super Bowl following the 1995 season. 3 championships in 4 years. A dynasty that felt almost inevitable once it began, as if the Cowboys were simply reclaiming something that had always been rightfully theirs. Emmitt Smith deserves particular attention. He was not the most physically imposing running back in the league. He was not the fastest. Scouts evaluating him out of college had questioned whether he was big enough or explosive enough to dominate professionally. What he possessed was vision, an almost supernatural ability to see the hole forming in the defensive line a half second before it opened, and to hit it at precisely the right moment with the right angle. He ran behind his blockers with a patience that other backs found nearly impossible to replicate. He absorbed punishment without complaint and came back for more every single week. When he retired in 2004, Emmitt Smith had carried the football 4,409 times in the NFL, more than any player in history. He had rushed for 18,355 yards. Both records still stand today. The Cowboys dynasty of the 1990s was not without its turbulence and off-field controversy. There were distractions that would have torn apart lesser teams entirely. Jerry Jones's appetite for control and attention created friction at every level of the organization. The painful departure of Jimmy Johnson left a wound that many inside the franchise believed never fully healed. And yet somehow, through all of it, the Cowboys won. 3 times in 4 years. With stars who played with a flair and a swagger that divided the entire country. You either loved them passionately or despised them, and either way you could not stop watching. That, perhaps, was the most Dallas Cowboys thing of all. By the late 1990s, the NFL was changing rapidly, and the balance of power was shifting. The Dallas dynasty had run its course. The San Francisco 49ers, without Walsh and eventually without Montana, were fading from their peak. A new generation of quarterbacks was emerging, faster, more creative, more willing to improvise under pressure. The game was opening up, growing looser and more explosive with every passing season. And then, from the most unexpected place imaginable, came a team that redefined what a professional football offense could look like. They played in St. Louis, they wore blue and gold, and they called what they did the greatest show on turf. The St. Louis Rams had been one of the least relevant franchises in professional football for the better part of a decade. They had moved from Los Angeles to St. Louis in 1995 and spent their first years there losing with a quiet consistency that drew very little national attention. Then, in the summer of 1999, their starting quarterback went down with a knee injury during the preseason. What happened next is one of the most extraordinary stories in NFL history. The man who replaced him was a 30-year-old backup named Kurt Warner, who had spent time stocking grocery store shelves in Iowa after going undrafted out of college. He had played in the Arena Football League. He had been cut and re-signed and waited and persisted through years of football that most people never see and nobody ever celebrates. None of that preparation was visible when he stepped onto an NFL field. What was visible was something else entirely. Kurt Warner was not a scrambler. He was not a runner. He stood in the pocket, surveyed the field with extraordinary calm, and delivered the football with a timing and accuracy that ranked among the finest the position had ever seen at the professional level. Around him, offensive coordinator Mike Martz had assembled a receiving corps of breathtaking speed and skill. Isaac Bruce and Torrey Holt ran routes with a precision and explosiveness that cornerbacks simply could not match consistently. Running back Marshall Faulk, perhaps the most complete offensive player of his era, could catch passes out of the backfield, run between the tackles, or bounce to the outside, making him impossible to defend with just one player. The offense moved at a pace and with a creativity that left opposing defenses confused, exhausted, and thoroughly demoralized. In the 1999 season, the Rams scored more points than any team in NFL history to that point. The Rams won the Super Bowl following the 1999 season, defeating the Tennessee Titans in one of the greatest championship games ever played. With less than 2 minutes remaining and the Titans trailing by 7 points, quarterback Steve McNair led a remarkable drive down the field. His receiver, Kevin Dyson, caught the ball near the 5-yard line and turned toward the end zone with a chance to tie the game and force overtime. Linebacker Mike Jones made the tackle at the 1-yard line as time expired. 1 yard. The Rams won by 1 yard. The play became known simply as the tackle, one of those frozen moments in NFL history that people who watched it live still describe with quiet awe decades later. Warner won the NFL MVP award that season and the Super Bowl MVP as well, the first player ever to win both in the same year. His story captivated the country in a way that went beyond football entirely. Here was a man who had been told repeatedly that he was not good enough, that his window had passed, that professional football was simply not his destiny. He had stocked grocery shelves and played in minor leagues and waited without any guarantee that the waiting would ever lead anywhere meaningful. And then one injury to one quarterback in one preseason game changed everything. Warner would go on to lead the Rams to another Super Bowl appearance 2 years later, losing narrowly to the New England Patriots, a game that introduced the football world to a young quarterback named Tom Brady. That story belongs to the next chapter. The greatest show on turf lasted only a few brilliant seasons before injuries, age, and the natural cycle of NFL rosters brought it to a quiet close. But what it represented endured far beyond those seasons. It proved that an offense built entirely around speed, precision, and creativity could not just compete in the NFL, it could completely dominate it. It proved that a quarterback nobody wanted could become the best player in the world. And it proved that the NFL could still produce moments of such brilliant and unexpected beauty that they felt almost too extraordinary to be real. Kurt Warner was eventually inducted into the Pro Football Hall of Fame. The grocery store shelf stocker from Iowa, a Hall of Famer. There has never been anything in professional football quite like what Bill Belichick and Tom Brady built together in New England. 6 Super Bowl championships, 9 Super Bowl appearances, 20 years of sustained excellence in a league specifically designed through salary caps, revenue sharing, and an equal draft system to prevent any single team from dominating for too long. The NFL's entire competitive structure was carefully engineered against dynasties. And yet, the Patriots built one anyway, quietly, methodically, relentlessly, with a consistency that left the rest of the league alternating between grudging admiration and exhausted disbelief. Tom Brady was selected in the 6th round of the 2000 NFL Draft with the 199th overall pick. 198 players were chosen before him. Quarterbacks considered more talented, more physically gifted, and more ready to contribute at the professional level were drafted in nearly every round ahead of him. Brady was considered a project, a backup at best, a very long shot at anything more. He ran the 40-yard dash in 5.28 seconds, one of the slowest times ever recorded for a quarterback at the NFL Combine. The scouting report written about him in 2000 described a player with poor build, very skinny and narrow, who lacked the physical tools to be anything beyond a career backup in the NFL. History has rarely been more extraordinarily wrong. Brady became the starter in New England in 2001 following an injury to Drew Bledsoe and led the Patriots to a Super Bowl victory over the heavily favored St. Louis Rams. Brady was 24 years old and was named Super Bowl MVP. Bill Belichick, the head coach who assembled the roster around him, had spent decades learning football under the legendary Bill Parcells, absorbing an approach to the game that valued meticulous preparation above all other qualities. Belichick was secretive and utterly unwilling to give opposing coaches any useful information. He was also the finest game planning coach the NFL had ever produced, capable of identifying and neutralizing any opponent's strength in a single week of dedicated preparation. Together, Brady and Belichick were something the league had simply never encountered before. The Patriots won 3 Super Bowls in Brady's first 4 seasons, in the 2001, 2003, and 2004 seasons. Each victory was decided by a field goal or less. Each one required Brady to manage the game with a precision and composure that reminded observers of Joe Montana, never rattled, never making the catastrophic mistake, always finding a way when it mattered most. Then came 2007. The Patriots went 16-0, only the second team in NFL history to complete a perfect regular season. Brady threw 50 touchdown passes, a single-season record that stood for years. They lost the Super Bowl to the New York Giants on one of the most improbable plays in championship history. Receiver David Tyree pinning the football to his helmet while a defender tried to drag him down. The helmet catch. It still haunts Patriots fans to this day. What followed over the next decade was a sustained excellence that defied every conventional understanding of how NFL careers are supposed to work. Brady won 3 more Super Bowls in the 2014, 2016, and 2018 seasons, bringing his total to 6 championships. In Super Bowl 51 against the Atlanta Falcons in 2017, the Patriots trailed by 25 points in the third quarter, the largest deficit in Super Bowl history. Brady led them all the way back to win in overtime. He was 39 years old that night. The comeback required 25 consecutive points against a dominant Atlanta defense. Brady completed 43 passes for 466 yards under the kind of sustained pressure that ends the careers of other quarterbacks. When the final whistle blew, he sat down on the field and wept. Tom Brady left New England after the 2019 season and signed with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. In his first year there, at 43 years old, he led Tampa Bay to a 7th Super Bowl championship. 7 titles. More than any quarterback in the history of professional football. More championships than any single franchise had ever accumulated. The debate about the greatest of all time used to be a genuine conversation. Brady's career gradually turned it into something approaching consensus. The skinny 6th-round pick with the slow combine time and the dismissive scouting report had become the most decorated player the sport had ever produced. Belichick won 2 more Super Bowls after Brady's departure, cementing his own legacy as the greatest coach in NFL history. 20 long years, 6 championships together. A dynasty the league was never built to allow. After 2 decades of Tom Brady, professional football needed a new story. The question was not whether the next generation of quarterbacks would be talented, It was whether any of them could carry the weight of what came before, whether the sport could produce someone new enough to feel genuinely exciting and great enough to make people finally stop looking backward at what had already been. It could, and it did, emphatically. The NFL that emerged in the 2000s was faster, more pass-heavy, and more quarterback-driven than at any other point in the entire history of the game. And at the center of it all was a young man from Tyler, Texas, who played football the way most people only dream about. Patrick LeVon Mahomes II was the son of a Major League Baseball pitcher and grew up with an athlete's instincts running in his blood. He was drafted by the Kansas City Chiefs with the 10th overall pick in 2017 and spent his first professional season learning behind a veteran starter. In his first full season as starter in 2018, he threw 50 touchdown passes and was named the NFL's most valuable player at 23 years old. What made Mahomes different was not just his arm strength, though it was extraordinary. It was the angles. He threw from positions that had no business producing accurate passes: sidearm while falling backward, off his back foot under pressure, across his body while sprinting, and the ball arrived exactly where it needed to be. He improvised constantly. He extended plays that had broken down completely. He made the impossible look almost routine. The Chiefs won the Super Bowl following the 2019 season, defeating San Francisco in a fourth-quarter comeback that felt both exhilarating and inevitable. Mahomes was named Super Bowl MVP at 24 years old, the second youngest quarterback ever to win the award in NFL history. Over the following seasons, the Chiefs appeared in 5 more Super Bowls and won 3 of them, giving Mahomes 4 total championships by his early 30s. A collection of titles that put him in a serious conversation with Brady that would have seemed completely impossible to imagine just a few years earlier. The Chiefs built their dynasty around him the way New England had built one around Brady, through smart drafting, disciplined coaching under Andy Reid, and a culture that gave Mahomes the freedom to be exactly who he was. But the generation that Mahomes defined was not his alone. In the 2020 NFL Draft, the Cincinnati Bengals selected a quarterback from LSU named Joe Burrow with the first overall pick. Burrow had won a national championship in his final college season, throwing 60 touchdowns and completing over 77% of his passes in a performance that left everyone who witnessed it thoroughly stunned. He was calm, self-assured, and possessed of a confidence that bordered on cool rather than arrogant. A player who seemed genuinely unimpressed by the magnitude of any moment he found himself in. In just his second NFL season, after tearing his knee in his first year, Burrow led Cincinnati all the way to the Super Bowl, where they faced Mahomes and the Kansas City Chiefs. The rivalry between Mahomes and Burrow became one of the defining stories of the modern NFL. They met in the playoffs repeatedly. High-scoring games settled in the final minutes that left fans struggling to find adequate words for what they had just watched. 2 quarterbacks with different styles but equal conviction and fire, pushing each other toward levels neither might have reached alone. Around them, the broader quarterback class of their era was extraordinary. Josh Allen in Buffalo, enormous, powerful, relentless, growing stronger as games grew desperate. Justin Herbert in Los Angeles, precise and gifted with one of the strongest arms in the league. Lamar Jackson in Baltimore, a 2-time MVP who forced every defensive coordinator in football to rethink how to stop a quarterback. The NFL in the mid-2000s was louder, faster, and more globally popular than at any point in its long history. International games in London and Germany were drawing passionate and enormous crowds to stadiums that had never hosted American football before. The league's television deals made it the most financially powerful sports organization on earth. A new generation of fans who had grown up watching Mahomes on social media were filling stadiums and driving ratings that dwarfed anything the league had seen in previous decades. And through all of it, the game remained exactly what it had always been. 11 players against 11, 60 minutes, 100 yards, and the possibility that something might happen that had truly never happened before. That possibility. That was always what made people watch. And that is why the NFL isn't just a league, it's a living, breathing piece of American history. From leather helmets and muddy fields to billion-dollar stadiums and primetime lights, the game has never stopped evolving. Generations have watched legends rise, dynasties form, and underdogs shock the world. The rules changed, the style changed, the speed changed, but the heart of the game? That never did. Every era gave us something unforgettable. The grit of the early years, the swagger of the 70s, the aerial explosions of the 80s and 90s, the dynasty battles of the 2000s. And today, a new generation rewriting what's possible on a football field. Different uniforms, different faces, same intensity. Because at its core, the NFL has always been about moments. Fourth-quarter drives that silence entire stadiums, goal line stands that define careers, draft picks that turn into icons, rivalries that feel bigger than the sport itself. It's fathers passing stories down to sons, friends arguing over the greatest of all time, cities rallying behind a logo stitched onto a jersey. History in the NFL isn't just written in record books, it's written in memories. And the craziest part? We're watching the next chapter unfold right now. Years from now, people will look back at this era the same way we look back at the greats. They'll debate it, romanticize it, analyze it. And somewhere, a kid watching their first game will fall in love with football the same way millions have before. That's the power of this league. So whether you're here for the stats, the stories, the strategy, or the nostalgia, just remember, the NFL is bigger than any single player, coach, or team. It's a timeline of greatness stretching over a century, and it's still being written. If you enjoyed this deep dive into NFL history, make sure you like the video, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment telling me which era you think was the greatest of all time. I want to hear your takes, because the debate never ends, and that's what makes football timeless. I'll see you in the next one.